what externalities were. And today we're going to discuss how economists do this, and there's going to be basically two parts to this. So what we said on Thursday was that externalities are problems where the social costs are accrue to a large number of individuals, or there are expert individuals who are very good at assessing the social costs who aren't one of the two parties involved in the transaction. And so each of those two things will inform one of the ways that economists try to tie down externalities. So one is using scientific expertise based on benefit cost analysis. And benefit cost analysis, I actually just ran a conference this past weekend about benefit cost analysis for financial regulation. Benefit cost analysis integrates economics with science, basically. It takes some inputs that come from scientific understanding of how some externality occurs, and it integrates that with economic valuation of the size and cost of those externalities. So as an example of that, we'll talk about the value of human life and how that made, and health, and how that made its way into benefit cost analysis. And we'll talk about one of the most famous benefit cost analyses ever, to which this was applied, which was the valuation of climate change. And then we'll talk about the other half of it, which is when information is very dispersed, and about contingent valuation surveys, which are surveys that are used to try to elicit from the public information about these dispersed valuations. And I'll introduce that idea, but then I'll quickly raise the strategic problems that it causes, and talk about mechanisms for dealing with those strategic problems, in particular the Vickrey-Clark-Groves mechanism, as well as its weaknesses, and alternatives to the Vickrey-Clark-Groves mechanism. Okay, so benefit cost analysis is probably the leading paradigm for policy evaluation, and it's supported by economists, at least most economists, based on this conference that I was doing. And it lines up well with the way that economists think about things, because it emphasizes trade-offs, pros and cons, and it's been applied to a wide range of decisions, from instituting and regulations, building public projects. One thing I've advocated benefit cost analysis for is allowing certain products to be used on the market. So if you're doing a benefit cost analysis for a public project, then sort of the burden is on the person who wants to put on the project, whereas you might want to put it on the private sector for creating some new innovation itself, like financial innovations, which was what we advocated it for. For us, the point of benefit cost analysis is going to be to determine externalities, the cap levels, or damages, and that's something that's very commonly used to do. So here the evaluation can either be to determine the optimal level or the amount of harm that occurs. Now the benefit, I think, of doing benefit cost analysis is it provides a rigorous language to try to make different dimensions of a problem commensurable in units of utility or dollars, which allows them to be compared to the direct harms of some restriction on economic resources. And it lets us put together many different things. The direct economic harms, limits on utilization of existing resources valued at the market value in different uses, effects on human life and health, which we'll talk about more soon, as well as more subjectively valued resources, which can be derived either inherently from ethical reasoning or from individuals' valuation of those resources. Now, a crucial element in benefit cost analysis is really technical, and it involves what the physical harms and benefits are that actually follow from some action. And this typically requires detailed knowledge of, among other things, physics. What are the actual chances of a nuclear spillover happening in a reactor like Fukushima, for example? That's basically a physics question. Chemistry. How much SO2 and what is the relationship between the amount of SO2 in the atmosphere and how much acid rain will take place, right? Epidemiology. How much does one person being vaccinated actually reduce the chance of other people contracting a disease? But all of these things are useless in a benefit cost analysis without an economic back end on them. So for example, if we could figure out what the probability of Fukushima occurring is, but we need to actually determine what the economic losses associated with such a disaster are. We could figure out how much acid rain will occur, but unless we know how much crops are actually lost as a result of that, or what the market value of those crops are, it doesn't benefit us anything to know that, right? We don't, it's not valuable to know these epidemiological things unless we know what the value is, the cost to people is of getting sick, right? So every benefit cost analysis involves a fusion of scientific expertise with economic analysis of what the benefits, of what the values of various things are. So perhaps the leading example of an economic input into benefit cost analysis is the value of human life. Now, value of human life is extremely controversial because a lot of people say life is invaluable. There's no way that we can put a value on life. But of course, if this were true, no one would ever drive a car, right? Every time you drive a car, you sort of take some chance that you'll die. What you have to choose is what things are worth investing in to try to reduce the chance of you dying. And you need some standard, some valuation of life in order to make those determinations. Because people, of course, do make trade-offs in terms of the risks that they face, right? People do some things that are dangerous because they enjoy them, and we need some way to figure out how to compare those things so that society can make the same sorts of decisions that individuals do, right? And this leads to some controversial conclusions because you very quickly determine that life is more valuable to the rich than it is to the poor because they would be willing to pay more in order to preserve their life than the poor would, right? And this might seem unjust, but it's just one more of the things that money buys, right? Money buys you more cars, more houses, more food, and it also buys you a greater weight that society puts on preserving your life. Now, if you want to redistribute from the rich to the poor, that's fine. But it seems crazy to say that the rich person shouldn't be allowed to spend their money on preserving their life and should be forced to spend it on frivolous things. And the poor person should be forced to spend all their money on preserving their life and not on the other things. So, it's just sort of necessary for efficiency that however we redistribute things, we allow a natural trade-off between how much people want to preserve their life and how much they want to do other things with their life. Okay. So thus, three things really need to be measured to measure the value of life. One is the value of a life, and it's called statistical value of a life because, of course, no one is going to be willing to die with probability 1. They're going to be willing to spend almost anything to do that. So you really have to measure, like, per unit chance of them dying, how much are they willing to pay to save it. You can also value other types of injuries or harms to their health. And finally, the elasticity of that with respect to income. And the existing estimate suggests that the elasticity with respect to income is about 0.6 to 0.8. So, yeah, Jose.
So 0.6 is like what? 1 unit more of income buys me 1.
A doubling of income or an increase of epsilon percent in your income would lead to a 0.7% times epsilon increase in the amount that you're willing to pay to save your life.
And do you think it's reasonable to assume that elasticity is constant between?
No. But, it's like about what we have. So I don't think there's a better number than this that exists. But I would be very open to other studies.
Same?
Yeah.
Sorry, in the paper we read, it gives us 0.5 to 0.6 value of income elasticity.
0.5 to 0.6 being the elasticity?
Yeah.
I see. Well, there are different papers by the same guy, actually, not by different guys. By the same guy, because he's like the expert for years and years and years on this subject. And this was from one of those papers, so, yeah. Okay. My intuition is actually that the elasticity is probably greater than 1, just on theoretical grounds. But, my guess is that the numbers have been manipulated to try to make that not the case, because it would be too politically controversial. But I can't be sure of that. But that would just be my guess. Okay, so the usual approach to measuring this number, can someone tell me what it is? Charlie's son's not here, so Luke.
Compare the wage of a lumberjack to the wage of someone who has a less dangerous but still physically active job.
Yeah.
And
Exactly. Use the difference in their wages as a measure of how much more people are willing to pay for one job versus the other. So assume, but this requires a lot of assumptions. You have to assume that the value of life is all determined by being alive versus being dead, and not how you die, right? Otherwise, you'd have to look for every way that people could die to find some comparison like this, right? And this is a basis of all the numbers, right? And that might be particularly problematic if some types of deaths were particularly painful or degrading in some way. Then you look for cases where people make trade-offs between the chance of them dying. So like take dangerous work, like you were saying, mining is the classic example, or the purchasing of a safer or less safe car that are otherwise similar, right? And you use the price differences as a measure of people's willingness to pay on the assumption that the marginal person is just indifferent between the two choices. But you can sort of see how problematic this is, because imagine that the price of having a safer car starts going down, right? Just for technological reasons, having nothing to do with people's willingness to pay for life, right? Now more people are going to move into buying the car, but not everyone's going to move. And then the value of life is going to drop, according to these estimates. Because you're just moving along the distribution of how much people are willing to pay for their lives, right? And so we're getting totally different estimates based purely on the technology for safety, right? And that comes out of an assumption that everyone is willing to pay the same amount as that marginal person. Yeah, Oliver?
That assumes you're only taking like one approach to estimating this value of life. Like normally don't they like have a half, like you're willing to pay for insurance,
They try to use many different things, that's right. That's right, they try to use many different things. So essentially, all of the estimates we have are based on this, and I think it's the best estimates that we have, but they're not great. Now, of course, you could run a survey and you could ask people how much they were willing to pay to save their life, but this is problematic for reasons we'll talk about later. Here are a bunch of studies. You can't really see them all. Here's the value that they get out. They're almost all in the $1 to $10 million range. So I think the safest thing to say would be it's somewhere in that range. But sort of probably the most common numbers are for like someone earning median income. It's about $5 million, and these are a little bit old, so it might be more like $7 or $8 million in the United States. Yeah.
I couldn't read those samples. Are any of these able to access what a rich person is willing to pay as opposed to?
Well, so that's what the elasticity numbers come out. They try to look at these things across countries and then use income to extrapolate in between them. And then, you have to like come up with the rich person's willingness to pay based on that.
So this table has two columns on the right-hand side. One's implicit value of life, and the other's implicit value of life to air travelers. So is that just using air travelers to calculate
income?
Income.
Yeah, so that's like a implicit value of life. This is like for the population studied.
Yeah.
And then the air travelers, like an average air traveler is a particular income level. That's the idea.
Yeah. But so you couldn't interpret like the air traveler column as having higher average income than that.
That's what you should interpret it as. Yeah. Yeah. So like this study must have been with richer people than this study was with, because there's a bigger difference between the air traveler and this column than there is between this and this column. So, okay. So probably the most ambitious benefit cost analysis of all time was the Stern Review. And this was commissioned by the British government and a bunch of international organizations, and the goal was to look at the economic benefits and costs associated with climate change. And this proceeded in many stages. Is Ye Bin here? Yeah. So what were the stages of? Don't look at your slides. Don't look at your slides. What were the stages of the Stern Review? Like what did they try to do in the process of it? You read the little report on it. What did they do in the Stern Review? What did they try to look at in order to figure out the benefits and costs of climate change? Did you read the thing? No. No, not really. Okay. Does somebody else want to talk about that? Yeah, Connor.
They tried to estimate the resource cost of not mitigating climate change. Wow.
How? What did they do? Like, what did they actually do in the Stern Review? I mean, it's like a 900-page report, right? You only had to read 27-page summary of it. But what did they do?
Well, it was just like the intricacies of how reducing like emissions affects like the productivity of various industries in the economy.
It's too vague. Tell me what they actually did. Somebody tell me what they actually did.
So estimating the cost of the GDP and try to figure out how to.
But how? How did they figure that out? Like, what did they have to look at? What factors did
Having
they?
not read the report, it's normally like a macro model where you can pay to like invest in capital, you can pay to abate greenhouse gas emissions. And
Yeah, but there's like a ton of science that goes into this stuff. That's like the key point, right? Like the main thing that they were doing was scientific. They were like, okay, so if you put this much carbon in, here's what the climate models tell us is going to happen to the temperature. If the temperature changes by that much, here's what's going to happen to the crops in all these different places. Here's what's going to happen to like the livability in these places. Here's the people that are going to have to move, et cetera, et cetera. And they added all that stuff up, right? So they had to determine, first of all, what are the largest sources of greenhouse gases. And Winnie, what are the largest sources of, don't look at your slides. What are the largest sources of greenhouse gases?
Factory emission.
Yeah. There's also one that's very surprising. That's one of the largest sources of green. Animals, yes. So farts from farm animals, right? Because it turns out like cows are responsible for like 30% of all greenhouse warming or something like that. Deforestation is another important source. Then they had to determine what the effects of these gases would be on the global climate. And how did they do that, Oliver? Look up.
Well, you just put your greenhouse gas input into some scientist's carbon model.
Exactly. Exactly. So they use the large-scale climate models that are filled with uncertainty, though aren't very good at handling that uncertainty. And they get some distribution of conditional outcomes, right? Then they have to determine the economic effects of these changes. And Luke, what are some of the most important economic effects? Yeah.
The rising oceans cause coastal areas to just no longer be coastal.
Yeah. Yeah. You get a little too much front on your beachfront property. Or
And so that's a huge issue alongside it messes up the fish because of acidification of the ocean. It messes up crops because the temperature gets too hot. It dries out the rainforest.
Exactly. So they try to come up with as many of these things as they can, right? I think the farm productivity turns out to be one of the largest factors. They then try to determine the extent to which adaptation can mitigate these things. And what does that mean? Is Munsu here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey.
I wasn't able to read it because the link didn't show up.
Really?
It actually wasn't done. Like you had to Google the name. to
Oh
get it.
shit! Somebody should have told me. I'm sorry about that.
Was the long version.
I see.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, you can get most of this out of the short version, but okay. Anyone else want to talk about adaptation? What do I mean by that?
We're accounting for new technologies.
Yeah.
Like how plants or whatever adapts. How plant adapts.
Well, in particular, that people might move away from the areas that get drowned, and that might make it less costly, right?
People might like warm climates.
Yeah, exactly. That's true as well. So this is important and can really reduce the amount of climate change, the impacts of climate change, because people might move where they do agriculture. It's not all just the effects on what's currently going on, but it's pretty hard to measure this stuff. And in particular, the institutions that would allow us to adapt effectively are somewhat deficient currently. So like, for example, there is a lot of flooding in coastal areas, but currently people don't really pay for the flood insurance they get because the government comes and bails them out, right? And so the lack of those institutions can make that adaptation much lower. And in fact, there was a study that Rick Hornbeck did on the Dust Bowl that showed that adaptation didn't really reduce the effects of the Dust Bowl nearly as much as you might have thought it would. And that, is one factor into thinking about these types of questions. Yeah, Oliver. No, okay. And what other types of impacts beyond these, in particular beyond warming, do people talk about climate change possibly having? Is Saad here? No. Actually, basically, Luke got this. Like, it could acidify the oceans, and it can affect ecosystems because of the mix of carbon and so forth. Okay. So, corresponding to the cap versus and trade versus tax paradigm, there are two approaches that the study took to looking at these issues. And again, Saad's not here, right? So does someone else want to say what were the two things that the Stern Review was trying to calculate? Corresponding, yeah, Jack.
You can try to measure the marginal cost of another ton of carbon emitted into the
Yep,
air.
at the status quo,
And
basically.
that's
Yeah.
business as usual. Like
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The other one is to try to establish some socially optimal level, a capping level.
Exactly.
And the advantage of that one is that there may be huge non-linearities that business as usual might be okay for a while until we get some critical amount, and that feedback loop is going to get affected.
Absolutely, yeah. So those are the two different approaches, and they really have the costs and benefits of exactly what we were talking about in terms of prices versus quantities. The prices approach is useful if it's pretty linear, the effect of carbon, and if we have a lot of uncertainty in the private sector would find it very costly to adapt a lot. On the other hand, if the whole world blows up beyond some point, right, then you want to put a cap. Okay, so the marginal, we basically just went through this. The estimate that they got was $85 a ton for the marginal cost of carbon in the business as usual scenario. The social cost, the socially optimal level of carbon, they thought was about 450 to 550 parts per million. And I know if anyone knows anything about this, these are completely unrealistic levels at this point. We're already on a trajectory to have no chance of staying within these levels. I think that the Stern Review is most useful because it illustrates how hard these issues are, and trying to do one of these cost-benefit analyses is. Just to take an example of that, one of the biggest costs associated with climate change is the possibility that these feedback loops that Jack was saying kick in, and that things really go to hell, and then you get a really, really bad outcome. Now, there's these geoengineering solutions, which I think a lot of people think are really bad, but the New York Times had an article this weekend about how some pretty serious scientists are now actually thinking about those, not because they don't think that they're bad, but because they think that there's this chance of a really catastrophic outcome, and that you would want to intervene before one of those catastrophic outcomes occur with the geoengineering, because even though they're really bad, they're less bad than these catastrophic outcomes. But if we know that we can do that, that actually dramatically reduces the cost of climate change, because it eliminates the worst possible outcomes, which we're accounting for most of the costs, and therefore makes it much less attractive to intervene now. So there's lots of complications in trying to do these types of things. Yeah, Peter.
What do you mean by geoengineering?
Oh, it's like you stick into the atmosphere some reflective particles that reflect sunlight, or you seed the oceans with lots of nitrogen to make algal bloom that would absorb a lot of carbon from the atmosphere or whatever. Crazy shit like that. Yeah, Oliver.
So I was going to say, what are your views on when you're cost-benefit analysis like the Stern Review, where all the costs have are future and discounted? Because I know Stern was kind of controversial because the other people who did these, the other economists who did these kind of cost-benefit analysis often used a market discount rate, and I thought Stern and some of his models argued that you shouldn't discount it there.
So I would say two things. First of all, I think that basically you should use market discount rates because that's what you need for Pareto efficiency. However, it could be possible that the discount rate in the market depends on the intervention you take, and then things get a lot more complicated because the growth rate of the economy might depend on what you do on these things. Then it gets a lot more complicated. And there's a paper by David Weisbach that's about that recently. The second thing I would say is that when there's a controversial parameter like that, I think that what you should do is set up something online where you can fiddle around and see what the effects are, and that's the best way to report this to the public. And I actually think that one of the biggest problems with the Stern Review is that it made everything equally hard to change in the model. where it's like you want to like make hard to change the parts of the model that like people aren't going to disagree about that much and that really just require expertise, and parts that are more subjective you want to allow people to like have access to and play around with, and maybe even get input from the public on. You
Like
see
a
what I mean?
1% change in the discount rate is like the difference between, you know,
Yeah,
carbon price of 0 and a carbon price of
huge amount. Yeah, no, that's true.
Why did you say the discount rate equal to market rate is necessary for productive efficiency?
Because otherwise, if you're like reducing in the future costs, you could always just save that money for the future, and the people would be better off.
I guess it's like the.
It's like yeah, it's like the hoteling depletable resources. Okay. Okay. So the Stern review focused on sort of hard economic costs, things that can, things that get destroyed or we can measure in dollars very easily, right? But it leaves out stuff like, do people like it being cooler or warmer with more rain or less rain, right? And that might sound totally frivolous, right? But look at the prices for living in Chicago versus living in California, and you'll know that that's not frivolous at all. That's like a huge, huge, huge economic effect, right? Another issue is, do people care about animals, right? Like, there's lots of animals that are going to be extincted. Like, how do we value that stuff? I don't know. Value on, like, what if we destroy some civilizations? Would that be, how valuable is that? If we destroy cities, how valuable is that? I mean, I guess you could just value it at the land value in the cities, but that doesn't seem to capture all the values we put in the city. It doesn't capture all the private knowledge about that individuals might have about how easily they can adapt to climate change on their particular agricultural plot. And again, you might say that's trivial, right? But if that's trivial, then all of Hayek's arguments about whether the market is valuable are out the window. Because his whole point was that this local information was really valuable, right? Yeah, Tova.
That could probably be accounted for, in knowledge of current agricultural technologies, right? Like the adaptation we're talking about. Yeah, it's true that like I might have, I don't know, I might be like a really good packer and like I'm moving at my family and moving my family, but that's like not that big a cost when you're talking about like when things are actually important are insurance and I don't know, disaster institutions, right?
Well, I mean, look, if you really take that argument, then why do we need the market system? I mean, Hayek, if we could really, as a central planner, figure out all of those things, and like the truth is, the adaptation to climate change is going to be just as much driven by market factors about which people on the ground have special knowledge as is any other economic process. So if these local things really weren't important, then we could just have socialism, I think. So, it may be necessary to use these really imperfect calculations because we don't have any way to get that information out of people, but clearly we could do a lot better with it because otherwise the market wouldn't have any value, Okay, so this is true for lots of different things. So subjective existence values of the environment or culture or the Grand Canyon or whatever, right? And these could be assigned by some expert, but some people would say that the value that they have to individual people, and people know how much value they have for that it's important to get that, right? We'll see how hard that is, but many would argue that it's very important and that we need to know things like that. Value of life, the subjective value of life for the inframarginal people. If we could get that value out of people more effectively, that would be very useful. Yeah, Arvid.
Has something like that been done, where they try to list like these really?
Oh, I'm about to talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, personally valued property or consumption and local information about technology and impacts. All those things are things that we need to have some way to elicit from people if we want to incorporate that information, which we should if we believe that decentralized information is important, right? So when such information is genuinely important, we try to elicit it. And I say genuinely important because there's some people who want to say, oh, just by definition, we can't know what these things are worth unless we get it out of some market price. And I think that's stupid because basically it's going to be incredibly hard to get this sort of information, as we'll see. And often, not only do individuals not know particularly well, but there's no reason why they should know or would want to know relative to an expert. So like, for example, how valuable is it not to have an oil spill in the Gulf? Well, they don't really know how many birds die and whatever. And like, what do they even know? Is that a particularly valuable type of a bird that died? Or is that a bird that there's a zillion of? So, in general, I think that when you can have experts, either assess the whole thing or get it down to some question that is actually accessible to people and they might actually have some information about, it's not worth it. And usually expertise can actually be good. So you really have to isolate, like, what is it that I have a reason to believe someone actually is informed about? And that's the only thing that you want. You want to try to narrow it down as much as possible and elicit only that piece of information about which you think people might have special knowledge. Yeah, Tova.
The reading basically say that even if you can do that, you're still getting in wildly differing responses.
Well, we'll see. We'll see about that in just one second. I'm saying even once we've narrowed it down to that, it's going to be very challenging. But yeah, Donnie.
Are there any insurance responses that are rates that we can look at to try to determine what implicit valuation people are putting?
Yeah, so you might be able to get some probabilities out of insurance, but you probably can't get valuations out of insurance because, again, insurance is only going to tell you what, like, the marginal person values it at or something like that, and it's all going to be determined. And given that, you know, most insurance is close to actuarially fair, that'll basically tell you that there's no value. But of course, that's because everyone's getting insured, and so the marginal person has no value for insurance, right?
I just
Arvid.
like, because one of the things with like surveys is that people wouldn't necessarily know how much they value.
Okay, we're going to talk about that.
But it's just because given that they don't know how much but that they have some kind of like distribution about how much they care, like saying that they don't know how much they value it does not necessarily equal that they don't have a value for it. Or
No, we're going to talk a bunch about all this stuff in just one second.
Yeah.
Okay. So the goal is information. Well, but the point is that if they're more uncertain than an expert is, then there's no point in eliciting the information from them, right? Yeah. So the goal is information, not like that just by definition we have to get the valuation out of individuals. So for example, if you were thinking about what's the inherent value of like preserving some culture, you know, there's a real question of whether you should, you know, if I make up some name of some civilization, the Amazon, is it really better to have an anthropologist figure that out, what's that value, or people? Well, probably some combination, because the anthropologist knows like how important are they, like, you know, how large are they, do they have a distinctive language, are they really just, you know, all this sort of stuff, right? And individuals might value those characteristics, and you might want to elicit information from individuals about how much they value those characteristics, but you might want the anthropologist to evaluate how much of those characteristics a given tribe has, not just throw the name out and an individual has no idea what you're talking about. Yeah, Tova.
But if they don't know what you're talking about, then like, isn't that the same as valuing as something at zero? Like, that doesn't make a difference on whether the question.
No, I don't think they would estimate it at zero. It's just that what you would get out of them would be completely noisy, even if you could extract it truthfully from them. Right.
But I don't know, isn't that more realistic, like the market value of this institution, like, or this civilization? You're saying like, you don't know very much about it, like you're not going to value it very much.
No, but that would be silly, right? I mean, like, what if we were to value everything in the market by like being like, oh, I'm going to offer to sell you X. What is X? Who knows? Right? I mean, it could be anything. It could be a computer. It could be food. It could be like a beautiful slave. I mean, it could be anything, right? I mean, like you just if we ran the market that way, it would like not allocate resources well at all, because you would be asking people to make guesses about, you know, their valuation for things that they have no information about.
You're saying like, okay, there's these many square miles in the Amazon, or this much rainforest will be destroyed.
Well, yeah, but that might mean literally not, like, if I say the following tribe will be like, or I just pull out some name,
Right,
like literally you're gonna have no idea.
That tribe has no impact on my life.
No, but I don't think that's true. Imagine what if that tribe turns out to like have some incredibly like important language that like holds the key to the origin of like human like speech, right? And like an anthropologist might know that, and you would have no idea, and it would be like incredibly stupid not to, you know, incorporate that into the decision we make. Now, you might have a good sense of like, how much do I value finding out about like, you know, the origins of human language, and you might say that's high or low or whatever. But clearly, like, I want to elicit from you something like that, because you would have a better sense than other people would have of what you value that. But you would not have a better sense than the anthropologist of like whether this tribe holds in its oral tradition like the history of mankind, and or you know, taking an example closer to home, like the location of the second, you know, the location of the ark of the covenant, right? For example, right? They might actually know that, but they just might not be able to communicate with people. And you might know that they know that, and some anthropologists might know that they know that. And then you'd be like, oh crap, I really made a mistake by saying I don't value saving that tribe.
But not really, right? Because like if it's really not going to, if like maybe one day we might discover this, but like that, it's not probably worth that much money. I don't know.
Well, I mean, but
like if it's okay, imagine they have some herb that like doctors know will cure whatever diseases, like that's a popular one now. Then like those.
Wouldn't you want to put more value on saving a tribe that had that property than saving any random tribe? What?
I'm saying like save the herb. That's the point.
Well, but the thing is, what if the only way to get the herb is to save that tribe?
That's what I'm waiting for. Isn't like what are we?
I mean, but the thing is, that's like what these calculations are usually about. They're like, this thing has a particularly distinctive culture. Its language has a following value, and so you have to like take that stuff into. I mean, if you don't take that stuff into account, then you would just say that there's no value of saving any of these civilizations.
Yeah.
Well, some people would say that, but a lot of people would make arguments like these for why you should, and why you should save biodiversity, and why you get ecosystem services, and all this sort of.
You can measure, right?
Well, yeah, but if I asked you, what is the value of saving one hoopa-doopa toucan? And you would say, I have no clue.
You ask the expert to determine the value, and then you tell me, okay, this toucan.
No, but if you tell them all the rest of that information, but think of how long it would tell them to take you tell that information, and like they would only be able to tell you that information if they consult with some expert. You know what I mean? And
it's different than the expert's not giving the value, right? The expert's just giving the information. You're still determining the value of that information.
Well, I think that what's giving the evaluation is a whole combination of information coming from all sorts of different people in society, right? And the question is, what stuff in a practical sense do I actually go and try to elicit from you? If I try to elicit from you, like I tell you the whole history of this tribe and then try to elicit from you a final valuation, that would take you forever and would give us very little information. So like what you want to elicit from people is whatever they have particular information about, which is useful to some overall calculation, which could also include stuff about, the history and
the. Just better off taking that culture and assigning some numerical value to that culture in terms of the country that hosts it, GDP, and then you can.
Well, that might be some part of the information, but it could be living in Tanzania, which is really poor, but happened to be an incredibly valuable tribe because it knows the location of some enormous amount of gold. I mean, it's just crazy to say that you don't want to try to account for all these types of information, including the information that comes from individuals about something that they might have better knowledge about in terms of their subjective valuation of some high-level characteristics, the existence of which the anthropologists might know about. You have to aggregate all those information in order to do this sort of thing.
Actually, have a
that's
fun fact about this slide.
Yeah.
There is an association, I think, which support the ugly endangered species.
I see.
So they are worried about the fact that people put too much weight on pandas and like cute animals that are endangered.
Yeah.
And so they I think to
tarantulas or like slugs or.
Yeah, I don't remember what were those animals, but the pictures were pretty ugly.
Yeah.
And they organized an election of the ugliest animal, I think.
Yeah.
You even didn't want to say that.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to say that.
So when we need this information, some people would say, why not just ask people, right? And there's a simple approach to this, which is called a contingent valuation survey. And what you do is exactly like the conversation I was just having with Tova. You say to people, imagine that we were to destroy the following thing. How much would you be willing to pay to not have it destroyed? How much would you be willing to pay to have it destroyed? And you just ask people that, and you assume that what they say is true. And that's it. And this is used for many environmental issues. It's also used for like the value of creating a transport infrastructure or the value of public goods more generally. So what are some classic examples of contingent valuation, Ye Bin?
Trying to save like extinct animals, like near extinct animals.
Yeah? Any other thoughts?
Like preserving parts of the world that are like environmentally.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's right. Probably the most famous example is the payment for preserving visibility at the Grand Canyon. They went around to a bunch of people and they asked them, like, you might someday go to Grand Canyon with your kids. Like, imagine now someone's going to build something that's going to like make it impossible to see the Grand Canyon. Like, how much would you be willing to pay for that? Preserving seals or whales in the ocean, avoiding logging in national forests, the value of the birds killed in the Exxon Valdez thing, preserving the language of indigenous cultures, building a new city. These are all things that have been subjected to contingent valuation, and the regulatory agencies and courts will commission these studies in order to do valuations to plug into benefit cost analyses. They also are used to assess damages from oil spills. And these are all formal money-based surveys where you're supposed to state a dollar amount. But sometimes there will be informal versions of these. So for example, just any survey that a politician does of public opinion influences politicians' decisions and is in some sense a loose and coarse version of a contingent valuation survey. It's binary, so it doesn't allow people to express how much they care, right? But there are some significant similarities between these things. Now, these surveys, as you read in the article, are in pretty low repute among economists. Zifeng, what are some of the reasons why contingent valuations?
I think that's one pretty important reason is that people just may not don't have an idea about the question you ask them.
Yeah.
For example, just we take the example like if you ask me how much I would pay for the preserving the Grand Canyon, I just don't know. Maybe
you might not even know what the Grand Canyon is. I mean, maybe now you do.
Well, I have some idea.
Yeah.
But I just don't know how much I would pay.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe $10, maybe 20, maybe not paying at all. I just don't have an idea.
Yeah.
If I were to answer you, I would just choose a random number.
Yeah. Yeah. So people don't take these things seriously at all. Is one problem. Like, how would you react if someone asked you a question like this, right? The other thing is people might answer the wrong question, so they might often say, how much is it worth it to the whole world to save this thing, rather than how much is it worth it to me personally? And of course, if you add up the whole world 1,000 times, you're not really going to get the right number, right? People also have no idea, information, or experience about the question you're asking. It takes a lot of reflection to determine a value for these things. People might be motivated by like warm glow, so they might want to say that they are willing to pay a lot even though they're not, just to make them feel good about themselves. And also, sort of indicating all these things, people's responses are incredibly inconsistent and irrational. Like you can ask the question in incredibly subtly different ways, and you can make like orders of magnitude difference in terms of what people report. So that sort of seems to indicate that this is not really very useful. Maybe most importantly, people have no incentive to get things right and no experience answering these types of questions. Yeah, Albert.
What about the people who are like making the survey? They want to find certain response from the people so they can set the survey in such a way that people respond.
For example, that's one thing that can happen that can make these very problematic. Absolutely. Okay. But once you take into account incentives, actually these things are much worse than they even appear when you don't take into account incentives. It really depends what the incentives are on what these surveys are used for. So one thing they could be used for is you just run this survey for fun and you report it as part of a research project and it makes no impact on the world whatsoever. So what are going to be people's incentives in that case? Matt? Matt, what are the... Oh, sorry, Matt. Matt O'Keefe? No. Not here. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
You basically have no incentive, right? You're just gonna sort of pick, you're gonna do whatever costs the least amount to you, so probably just random.
Or feels most fun to say, or whatever, I don't know. Whatever screws with the mind of the, survey person the maximum amount. Yeah, absolutely. Now, what about if the survey has a huge impact on public policy in an area you really care about? Luke, what would be your incentive then? Luke J.
I guess just to be as honest and truthful as possible.
Really? Really? What do you think, Vidar?
If you it's about animals or something, you're a huge environmentalist, you're going to massively overstate it. And if you are the opposite, you're going to say you don't care about it at all. So
Yeah, so if you don't want if they ask you, what's the value of the Keystone XL pipeline, killing deer in, Montana, if you're someone who works on the Xtel pipeline and wants it to be built, you'll say 0, right? And if you're an environmentalist who doesn't want it to be built, you'll say, oh, just only a few $1 trillion, right? That's the personal value to me of having the, right? So you'll never have an incentive to report truthfully, right? So the great example is the story I told you last time. I don't know if you remember about in Haiti when they ran around asking people, right? Okay, so if we want to take seriously this sort of an idea, we need to take seriously the incentives that people have in reporting on these things. So to take an example of this, imagine that I know the net private benefit of an activity, and I want to determine the socially optimal quantity of it, right? And everybody knows how much they're harmed as a function of the quantity. The total harm is the sum of everyone's harms. And we're going to determine an optimal cap by figuring out what maximizes the difference between the benefit and the harms. The question is, how can we get people to truthfully report the harms? Moonsu? How can we do that? Did you read about a mechanism that might help you to do this? Which mechanism? Which mechanism gets you to report truthfully? Anybody else? Tovid? Yeah.
How do we know the private net benefit is my question.
What?
How do we determine the initial private net benefit?
Well, I mean, you can get that out of this process too. I was just, yeah. Kevin, do you have an answer?
Yeah, the Greek Clark Rose.
And how does that work?
So it's kind of like everybody will enter their value for the project or whatever, and they'll have to pay. They'll have to pay their portion of what like the final.
Yep.
No. The only person who pays is the person who changes the decision social.
Tiago, yeah, of course, yeah. That's right. Can you explain a little bit more?
Well, every person's gonna make let's say how much it values the good or whatever. And if you take out that person and evaluates the other person's decision, and if when you put that person again and this person changes the social decision, it's, I don't know what to call it in English. It's pivotal.
It's pivotal.
Pivotal, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Then she's gonna make a payment.
Yeah, so what this basically does is it pushes the question back one layer. Everyone reports how much they are harmed, and you treat that report as if it was an action. And we know that for every action people take, they should pay the externality that they create, right? So to determine the amount of the externality, we have everyone pay their externality, right? And so the question is, what is the externality in this case of me reporting that my cost is H hat as opposed to 0? John? Or Jack? That's what it must mean. I don't know why I wrote down John on here. Yeah, Jack.
Well, as Tiago was saying, basically, if I'm the pivotal person, the externality is if my valuation is what makes me get it, and the externality is the next highest valuation value.
Well, so here I give a very particular context. You're reporting how much harm it causes to you. So, and we're going to determine the amount, which is where the marginal benefit intersects the marginal harm. So what would be your payment here?
So versus 0, I see what you said.
Yeah.
If I report 0%, if I report positive H, basically my reporting positive H goes into the sum of costs. So take the sum of everybody else's harm besides mine, and then my addition to that cost is basically the externality of how it changes the decision.
Is it? The amount of harm that I say that it caused me?
No, that's not.
So the question then, what do I end up paying in this situation?
So take the sum of everybody else's harm besides mine.
Yeah.
Take the net benefit. I'm trying to remember what that looking at the slide.
But wouldn't you just have like a policy function which turns everyone's reports into...
Sure.
And then you just say the policy function when I report H hat minus the policy function when I report 0.
Sure, but what does that look like? I mean, think about it. This is a nice continuous price theory setting. Everyone else is reporting benefits and harms, and then you add my harm in. What is that going to do?
Well, it changes the likelihood of which decision.
Well, it's just a continuous queue that we're choosing. The quantity of something to do.
So if we want to maximize B minus H,
Yep.
Take that difference without my valuation.
Yep.
Take that difference with my valuation.
Yep.
And then measure the effects on Q, on the optimal Q that is.
Yep. And what do I pay then?
You pay then the valuation, let's see, how other people's welfare changes with that Q that changes.
Yes. Let me show you a picture of this, and I think it'll make it much clearer. So, imagine this is the cost to you, and this is the cost to everybody else. And imagine this is the social value. So you add these two together, and you get the cost to society. Here's what would have been chosen if you hadn't been in. Here's what is chosen, and you pay the Harburger triangle between those two things. Right? Okay. So, here's the math corresponding to that. So, society maximizes where the benefit minus the harm is greatest, which is that the marginal benefit equals the marginal harm. And then you have to pay how much higher, without you, the benefit minus harm would have been to everybody else. So that's a Vickrey-Clark-Groves mechanism. Everyone reports HI. The cap is set to maximize the total benefit minus harm. And each individual pays how much higher the benefit minus harm for everyone other than themselves would have been had they reported 0 benefit. And then they may receive payments back from the system, but they have to be independent of whatever they reported. Okay, so there's 2 important notes. The individual need not report their full HI, right? They need not report, as I was talking about with Tova, how much is this particular culture or tribe or species worth to me. They could just report some parameter, like how much is medicine worth to me. And if their payments are determined through the process by if they had reported a different number for that question, what would have happened, and they pay, the relevant Harburger triangle associated with that, that will still work just as well and give them truthful incentives. Yeah, same.
So individuals don't have the knowledge of how much they're willing to pay.
Yeah, well, I mean, they might not have a knowledge of how much they're willing to pay, but they might know some parameter that's relevant to that question, like how much is medicine worth to them, or how much is the history of the, learning the history of the religion or history of languages worth to them. And if they report that and their payment is based on how that impacts the final decision through this mechanism, then people will have an incentive to report truthfully.
But I mean, we don't know the amount they have to pay before they give their...
No, but once everyone gives all their reports, you do know it, and that's what this does. It bases it on what everybody else said.
So the individual is making a decision without the knowledge
of how much they'll pay. They know they have an incentive to report truthfully, but they don't know how much they'll pay. I mean, this is one of the problems with VCG, as we'll talk about in a minute. But yeah, that's right. Donnie?
Depending on how big a share they are of the whole, couldn't it change exactly what their incentive is? Like if they're a tiny, tiny fraction of the entire decision?
As long as the amount of money they get back is independent of how much they report, they always have an incentive to tell the truth. And the reason is that they're paying the externality they have on everybody else, and so that makes them essentially in the same position of society as a whole, right? And so they're going to choose whatever. So I'll give some examples of how that works, but it works on the exact same principle that payments in accordance with product works. It's that I'm internalizing everything from the rest of society, so I'll make whatever decision would maximize the total welfare. The other key issue is that the externalities have to pay not to those who are harmed, but to the government or to some outsider. Because otherwise you have an incentive to make it look like you were harmed a lot. so as to get everybody else to have to pay a lot, so because they paid it back to you. Okay, so the most common practical application of the VCG mechanism is the second price auction. And Sang, could you describe that and how it's an example of this? Look up, Sang. Could you describe the second price auction and how it's an example of this?
I think it had to do with, so like if you have an auction, people bid,
Yeah.
and you sell to the second highest bidder.
Nope.
That's not it.
You don't sell to the second highest bidder.
Oh, you sell to the first bidder at the second highest price.
Exactly. And how does that reflect this idea of you're paying your externality?
Because you have an incentive to not.
Now, first tell me how you're paying your externality. In what sense are you paying your externality here?
So like you deny the chance of the second guy.
Exactly. If you hadn't bid, he would have gotten it, and he would have gotten however much value he reported, and so that's the sense in which it's that. Now, okay, so suppose everyone bids for an object, and the winner pays the second highest price. They pay the externality on the guy who didn't get the object. So you want to bid your valuation. So to see that, notice that what you bid doesn't affect how much you pay, conditional on you winning, right? And you never want to bid lower or higher than your valuation. Why? Well, imagine that you bid lower than your valuation. And it doesn't matter if whoever bids is either lower than what you bid or higher than what you would have bid, but if they're somewhere in between, right, then you could have won by bidding your valuation, and you could have paid less than what it was worth to you, because that person was bidding in between. If you bid higher than your valuation, then you might end up winning at a price that was above what you valued it at, and you would always continue to win at prices lower, and it makes no difference for the price you pay, right? So this is so you always want to bid truthfully. And there's more general versions of this. Imagine that there were like a bunch of different objects we were selling, and I might want collections of them. I could submit a bid for every package, and then I could pay however much surplus would have been created in the arrangement that would have happened had I not bid for the collections. You could also use this in the course selection context with artificial currency. And there's many proposals to use this, but it's very uncommon in practice. One proposal to use this could be as an alternative to eminent domain. So imagine someone comes in and makes an offer for a collection of land, and the people don't want necessarily to give up their land, right? So they could say how much their land is worth it to them, and they could get to keep their land if and only if the sum of all their values were greater than the amount that was offered for the land, right? So then you would have to pay if you were responsible for stopping the assembly from taking place. So if the offer that was made was greater than everybody else's valuation, but not greater than everyone else's valuation plus your valuation, then you'd have to pay the amount by which everybody else in total would have preferred the sale to go forth. Yeah, Oliver.
But in that context, does everybody have to pay that amount, or how do you determine the marginal person?
Everybody has to pay that. So that sort of shows the problem with this system, right? Because you're going to end up collecting all this revenue.
Or everyone who's pivotal.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so VCG is elegant, but people don't use it very much. And so there's a famous paper by Ozabel and Milgram saying that the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism, the Vickery auction is lovely but lonely. And why, Luke, is the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism lovely but lonely?
Well, people don't like it very much because of I have to put down this number and I don't know how much it will cost me, and if you're doing this.
Yeah, so it's very unpredictable,
right.
And that interacts very badly with people's budgets. So like, if I really care about something, but I know I only have a certain amount of money, I have to risk going totally bankrupt in order to do this, right? That's great. Other reasons? Do people have other reasons?
Just on that one.
Yeah, Oliver, yeah.
Would it be possible to create an insurance market? if you you're worried about risking your entire budget.
So an insurance market is going to correspond pretty closely to another mechanism.
To figure out whether it's actually going to.
Yeah, they'd have to do a lot of due diligence, and it would be very individual specific. I think it would, and there'd be a lot of adverse selection there. So I don't think that would work very well, because people who had some information about what was likely to happen would then get the insurance only in cases where they were likely to make. You see what I mean?
Like, I guess it wouldn't be so much an insurance market, but rather you'd be paying this insurance company to aggregate the information before you wouldn't you?
Well, we'll talk about a version of the auction that's a little bit like that, actually. But
Collusion problems.
yeah, describe that.
So I could take out an insurance policy, and then we could both bid crazy amounts of money, and I'd be sure to get it, and we'd pay, but the insurance company would be covering us.
Yeah, that's true as well. But another problem, I mean, there's moral hazard problems to start with, right? But the worst collusion problem with VCG is that if you imagine that there's some like binary decision that we're all making. If I report a really extreme value and you report a really extreme value, then the decision is going to be made the way that we both want, regardless of what we reported, right? Individually. Because the other one reported something so extreme that it pushed it over. And so neither of us is individually pivotal, and we make no payments, and we get whatever we want, right? So for example, one time Hal Varian was running an experiment in his class at Michigan, and he had everyone say, do you want this test date or that test date? Tell me your willingness to pay. And initially everybody was like, oh, I'll pay $3 for this day, $2 for that day, whatever. Then these two girls who were good friends came along, and one said, I'm willing to pay $500 for it to be on this day, not this date. And he said, why are you willing to pay $500? Oh, you know, I have absolute commitment. It's worth that much to me. Then the next girl said, I'm willing to pay $1,000 for it to go on that day too. And so, of course, they got that day, and neither of them paid anything, because neither of them was individually pivotal, right?
Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, Tova.
Maybe I don't really understand VCG, but
Yeah.
like, why wouldn't everyone just pay?
Why wouldn't everyone?
As in,
Oh, because imagine that I got caught being pivotal. That girl who said $500 on that day, if it wasn't worth it to her $500 and everyone else went $400 in the opposite direction, she'd be forced to pay $400. And then she'd be really screwed. It's only because she's guaranteed not to be pivotal that.
no, but if you don't believe in a pivotal person,
Oh, nobody pays. If no one's pivotal, no one pays.
but why is that?
Because that's that's VCG. It's you only pay if you're pivotal, and you only pay the amount by which you're pivotal.
So how do you determine how pivotal you are if you're someone's pivotal?
You say what would have happened had they bid 0.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, Oliver.
can you like make a version of the VCG with like coalition that kind of gets around that incentive problem, or like?
Basically, no. I mean, at least almost. There's lots of fixes you can do for VCG, which is already a damn complicated mechanism. But almost all the fixes you do make other problems with it worse, and don't really fix the problem all that well, and undermine its initial appeal. So there are some things that are related to VCG that we'll talk about that are very good. But no like little tweak on VCG works well. I think just it's fundamental at some fundamental level. It is a nice insight behind it, but it's basically as a paradigm, it's bankrupt. I think. Yeah, Kevin.
So it's not even like necessarily collusion, but the fact that all the HIs need to be like kept hidden from one person that makes it problematic. Or am I understanding that wrong?
No, I mean you always have a weakly dominant strategy to report truthfully. So even if you knew everybody else's values, you would still report truthfully. But if you could in any way coordinate your behavior with someone else who agrees with you, then you can completely break the system.
Okay.
But you need to change what somebody else does. But I mean, the thing is, you could even pretend like you were 2 people, and then you could completely destroy the system. Right? If you could even pretend to be 2 people, you can completely ruin the system.
So it's not dominant.
No, it's weakly dominant. Weakly dominant. So there's a huge number of equilibria. So you always like can't do better than reporting your truthful value unilaterally, but there's lots of other things that you could do just as well doing. Okay. The other thing is like all the money that you pay in has to go to like the government or to somebody else, not to not to anyone who's participating. But if this is a big social decision, who can you give it to? I mean, you have to like burn the money, you have to destroy resources. And the amount of resources you destroy might be bigger than the efficiency that you gain by using the mechanism. So that's a big problem as well, right?
Why can't you redistribute the money?
Because if you did, you'd run into exactly this problem. Imagine I redistribute the money back to people. Because how much everybody else is paying is determined by how pivotal they are, I'm then going to take actions to make me, like other people, more pivotal, so that they have to make payments to me. You see what I'm saying?
But isn't the point to increase like the aggregate utility or social optimum?
Yeah, but I'm not going to tell the truth then, right? So like imagine that, you know, there was those girls and I was like, those asshole girls, I want to get the money from them. Let me report a really big number just to get them caught so they have to pay me. Yeah, Kevin.
But you would only know to do that if you knew that the girls were going to report $500.
Well, that's true. I mean, so you don't know exactly how to do the best thing, but you certainly wouldn't have an incentive to tell the truth. Like if you had any sense that they were reporting a lot, you would want to at least shade a little bit in the opposite direction just to screw them.
But if you don't know that they're doing it, you have no incentive. Like, isn't that's
Well, but I mean, you're not generally going to have truthful incentives either. Then, who knows what incentive you
well,
have?
just your incentive is to report just your value.
No, it isn't.
If you're wrong.
No, because you would. I mean, in general, you'd always have an incentive to exaggerate your value at least a little bit in that situation, because you would have some chance that you're not pivotal, and in that case, if someone else is pivotal, you'll get more money. You see what I mean?
That's a smaller difference than like with collusion.
Yeah, I think collusion is the worst problem, but yeah, there's lots of problems. So the question is, why does VCG go wrong in all these ways? Like, what's the fundamental thing that's driving all of these effects we were talking about, Connor? There's sort of one thing that drives everything that we've been talking about so far. Can anyone see what it is?
That they don't know themselves necessarily what it is. There might be some like noise about their own valuation of it.
Anybody else? Yeah. What's your name again?
Tyler.
Tyler. Yeah.
As an individual, you're not allowed to know what other people's valuations are. Otherwise, you could.
No, that's not a problem. What? Anybody else? Because if you knew everybody else's, you'd still have a weakly dominant strategy. But there's something. Yeah, Luke.
It's not strategy proof.
No, it is strategy proof.
Oh, okay. I don't know what that word means.
Then it's dictatorial.
Yeah. Anybody else have thoughts? So I think the key problem is that you're relying on other people to say what you should be paying, right? The system is not letting you determine what you pay. It's making other people determine what you pay. And that gives you huge incentives to collude with other people so that you can get them to change how much you pay. It doesn't let you refund the money back, because then you'll be affecting what other people pay. And if you're getting some refund from that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these problems are a result of the fact that VCG is depending on other people to say what you're supposed to be paying, right? So what you really need is some objective information somewhere down the line, right? If we're relying on everyone to tell what everybody else's externalities are, then there's this big problem, right? You need some way to make people prove the externalities that they have on other people. So if one person is going to pay for saying something, then they need to know what other people might do. And so we need some objective information to anchor what people are paying. And this is the idea of the expected externality mechanism that we'll return to in a moment. Okay. Unfortunately, there's some very pessimistic results. So there's a result by Green and Lafont that says the only system where you always have an incentive to tell the truth regardless of what everybody else is doing is the VCG mechanism. Because it's the only system that guarantees that no matter what everybody else is doing, you tell truthfully. But on the other hand, we know that this system totally sucks. So that is to say there's no system where, regardless of what everybody else is doing, you always want to tell exactly the truth.
And still, as you said, it's like only weakly dominant.
Yeah, and even then it's only weakly dominant. There's no other system that's even weakly dominant. Okay. In fact, there's another system that is logic that says if a system is efficient, then anyone who's changing a decision at any point has to pay the expected externality that that causes, the average externality that causes in other people. Now, that doesn't have to be their exact VCG payments, because if we know what the expected externality they have is, that is, we know the average among other people, the average amount that their externality is going to create, that's like the insurance market that Oliver was talking about, then we can charge them that average externality rather than charging the amount they actually end up creating, right? But that creates a lot of benefits, because then you can give people back the money, because it's not the actual amount of externality that people cause that they're paying, and therefore people can't affect how much other people are paying, right? And the collusion issues, this is not true. There actually are really bad collusion issues here. I thought this was true before, but let me give you why there's really bad collusion issues here. So imagine that we have one of these collective decisions we were talking about before, where we're making the decision between two things. So before, if you both report really extreme values, that solved the problem. Here, that wouldn't solve the problem. You would still both end up paying a lot. But imagine that you know what like the total amount that everyone's going to vote in one direction is. Imagine you think it's like $500, right? Now imagine that each of you does $260 in the opposite direction. Now each one of those on its own is very unlikely to change the decision, so has a very small expected externality. But you two together almost certainly change the decision, and so that has a very large externality. But the expected externality doesn't make you pay for that. So there's huge collusion issues in this mechanism as well. So the more, it's more common in practice, because this does have a little bit more attractive properties, that people try to use some version of the expected externality mechanism rather than the VCG mechanism. So an example of this is the first price sealed bid auction. That's a time when you're reporting how much you're going to pay based on what your guess of what the next highest person values it is. What do you just need to win, right? So this first price auction is sort of like the expected externality mechanism, right? So a major problem is trying to find versions of the expected externality mechanism that we can use in various places. And just to give you a preview of something we'll do in the last class, notice on these collective decisions that this is always a Harburger triangle, right? That is, it's always quadratic in the amount by which you affect the decision. That is basically the source of what we'll talk about in the last class, which is quadratic vote buying. Yeah, Kevin.
So viewing like second price auction as an example of VCG, so can you give an example of how the collusion in that works in some like thoughts?
It doesn't work nearly as well in that context.
Okay.
It works much better in collective decisions, but there is a way that it works, which is that imagine that I scream out, I really want this thing. Then the other person has no incentive to bid at all, right? So you can bid a bazillion and pay zero, right? Because the other person won't bid at all. If they know that you're going to bid a lot, there's no reason for them to bid. That wouldn't happen in a first price auction. In a first price auction, if you bid really low, the only way you can pay little is by bidding really low. But if you're bidding really low, the other person has an incentive to bid higher, right? So it's not as extreme there, but it can still happen. Okay. So to sum up, there's no really perfect solution, right? So scientific studies have the advantage that there's not as much incentive problem as long as the expert is well motivated. Who knows whether that's the case or not. But if the expert is well motivated, it doesn't have the incentive problem. But the disadvantage is it leaves out all this subjective private information, and of course the expert might be corrupt, at least in principle. Contingent valuations try to elicit this private information, but they're a total disaster for all the reasons we talked about. The VCG mechanism gives good incentives robustly, except in practice it makes no sense. The expected externality mechanism is much more practically useful when it's feasible, but it's not always obvious how to make it work. So in practice, what we have to do is be flexible and try to combine these approaches, or try to find other mechanisms that get at some of these things, but don't do any of it so perfectly. And I'll advocate in the last class that in many contexts, quadratic voting is a powerful mechanism for these types of problems. Yeah, Tova.
So how does, when you do what they call reverse auctions or whatever, where you bid down?
Yeah.
So they say that those are usually a bit more effective than the normal auctions.
So when you bid down, that's equivalent to a first price auction, basically.
So why do they say they work better?
Well, for the same reasons that a first price auction might work better.
No, better than the first price auction.
Oh, better than first price auction? So I don't know much. I don't know about those claims that they work better. That must be some behavioral thing, because there's very strong senses in which those are equivalent.
There's an advantage in speed, that it goes really fast because no.
It's got to be behavioral. I mean, there's like under like the weakest forms of expected utility anything, those are equivalent to one another.
No, because with the first price auction, right, you can get a good sense of how much another person values a product. It's based on their bids.
Oh, you're saying bidding up or bidding down?
Yeah. So I'm talking about bidding. When you're bidding.
You know, first price auction is sealed bid. You can't get any sense of what anyone says. First price, second price, or English auction, you can get a sense, but not in the first price auction. First price auction, you just submit a bid and you pay what you bid if you win. So, yeah. Yeah, Munsu.
Going back to this question, for
Yeah.
the second auction,
Second price auction, yeah.
second price auction, I don't see how, because one say that he will bid a lot, the others will be discouraged to vote.
Well, they don't care. They could bid their thing, but they don't have any reason to bid that. So if they have any concern for you, they'll bid 0, right? Because they have no reason to bid anything positive, because they're going to lose, right?
But then they don't lose anything by bidding what they evaluate.
That's true. They're indifferent. But that's the same thing that happened in this other situation. Is like the problem is you're indifferent between too many different things, right? Whereas that's not true in the first price auction. If someone else tries to bid low in the first price auction, you want to beat them. Whereas here you can get away in a collusive way with bidding low, and no one has an incentive to deviate from that. So it's very easy to sustain collusion. Thanks, guys. So you've got a problem set on Thursday. But if anyone has any other questions, I'm obviously here.